Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is August the 3rd, 2015. The show is being pre-recorded, in the span of 2 days, really. August 2nd is when we're recording this segment. At the end of the segment, at the end of the show, last half of the show, actually, I'm going to play an interview that I did with Afraa, who's been a regular guest here on Truth on the Tracks. She is in Syria. She's on the ground in Syria and can give us a good idea of what is happening there. So we're going to talk to her in the second half of the show. The first half, I'm going to try to do my best to go over what's happening with the ISIL free zone. So we've only got a little bit of time to cover that, so I'm going to try to do my best. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night and at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and 7 nights a week, really, here on UCY.TV, and also on Reality Bites Radio, being rebroadcast over there. So the show is continuing to grow. If you're interested in my work, you can go to activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, brandonturbeville.com. Those are the websites my articles come out regularly. And, of course, BrandonTurbeville.com is sort of the home site. That's the base of operations. That's where all of the articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archive versions of this show are posted, and that's where all of the relevant information is at. The contact information, the bio, all of that stuff is available there on the website. So we need to get into the Syrian situation because this is something that is continuing to develop. Now, the idea, we had Turkey calling for an emergency NATO meeting last week. We had they called this meeting with NATO based on Article 4, and Article 4 allows any member of NATO to request assistance when its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. So this is what they did. Actually, the Article 4 reads, the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. That's the full Article 4. Now, it is not a declaration of military operations like Article 5, which recognizes an attack against one member as an attack against them all. But it is a step in that direction. It is the step in the direction of direct military confrontation with the Syrian government. We had, before the meeting, we had NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg saying that, quote, Turkey requested the meeting in view of the seriousness of the situation after the heinous terrorist attacks in recent days, and also to inform allies of the measures it is taking. NATO allies follow developments very closely and stand in solidarity with Turkey, end quote. There's also the report coming from Sky News Foreign Affairs editor Sam Kiley that NATO surveillance aircraft will be deployed along the Turkey-Syria border. Okay. But he also reported that Turkey was requesting the establishment of a safe zone or a buffer zone, a no-fly zone, whatever you want to call it, over the northern portion of Syria along the border with Turkey. As Kiley said, it is part of its argument for safe zones inside Syria along its borders that would be policed by armed forces, presumably from NATO members and the members of the U.S.-led coalition. So we have that. Turkey has called for an Article 4 NATO meetings twice in the past. They did that in 2003 and once in 2013. In the 2013 incident, we had Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States sending 2 Patriot anti-missile batteries, as well as soldiers trained in the operation of those missile batteries, to Turkey. They were requesting help with its border security due to the crisis in Syria in 2013 as well. Now, we had a report in April that the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris were in high-level talks regarding a plan to invade Syria in the relatively near future. And I wrote an article on that, was breaking, and the reports were it was either going to happen that week, and this was April, or in the coming months. And, well, here we have the coming months, and we're seeing these things develop. Now, the of course, any meetings called by Turkey are entirely hypocritical, right? Because Turkey, they can whine and complain about ISIS all they want, but ISIS was trained, funneled, funded, facilitated from Turkey itself and placed into to Syria by them. So very hypocritical of them. But again, this is a problem that Turkey has helped create. Now, just not to belabor this point too much, because we only have a limited amount of time before we get to our interview, but we've got to point out that, you know, going back to 2011, and even actually as far back as 2007, 2005 really, go back, the U.S. has been arming and funding and training and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and a number of other terrorist organizations, Free Syrian Army, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, all of those groups, to fight the Assad government in Syria and fight Hezbollah in Lebanon and undermine the power and influence of Iran and the Shiite Crescent. And of course, that would include any other government or group in the Middle Eastern region, North African region that's friendly toward Iran, and this is a geopolitical concern. Billions of dollars in cash has been funneled into the hands of terrorist groups, including, again, al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, the ISIS fighters, you know, with the name change. All you have to do is look at the map, and we're going to be talking about another very important map here in a second, and you can clearly see by any map of ISIS-held territory that it goes directly, it butts up against Turkey's borders with defined corridors that ISIS uses to invade southward into Syria. This is because it is from NATO territory that the group originated, right? It comes from NATO, and that's the reason that it butts up against the Turkish borders, is because it's coming from Turkey. ISIS was harbored on NATO territory. It was armed and funded by U.S. CIA agents with cash and weapons that came from the Saudis and the Qataris and other NATO members. This so-called non-lethal aid that we heard about early on, the U.S. and British sent the vehicles we've seen ISIS using over the last few years. So the ISIS is itself a product of NATO and the GCC. Again, going back as far as 2005. Back in 2007, we had the U.S. and Saudi policymakers that were trying to ignite a region-wide sectarian war to purge the Middle East of Iran's arc of influence across, you know, Syria and Iraq, and then into Lebanon as well, even to the coast of the Mediterranean. But 2005, the plans go back in terms of the reports by Hirsch and Berry of Newsweek. But you could check up on that yourself. Again, ISIS has been funded, trained, facilitated all by NATO and the Persian Gulf states within Turkey's borders, even with the help of Israel as well. If you look at the fact that we had an example of this was when we had a cross-border invasion by Al-Qaeda into Qasab village, and that's in the Latakia province in northwestern Syria, where we had a cross-border invasion that was coordinated with NATO, Turkey and Israel and the terrorists, where Israel acted as an Air Force cover, and while Turkey facilitated the death squad invasion from its own borders that actually had terrorists that were funded by the Saudi Arabians and the GCC and helped to be trained in Jordan. So you can see how this goes. Remember also that before the appearance of ISIS officially in Syria and Iraq, we had European media outlets like Der Spiegel reporting that there were hundreds of fighters being trained in Jordan by Western intelligence and military personnel for the purpose of deployment in Syria to fight against Assad. Those numbers that were hundreds at the time were said to be expected to reach about 10,000 fighters when the reports were issued in March 2013. And, although, the Western and European media would try to spin this operation as training moderate rebels, the reports that came out later actually revealed that these were fighters, ISIS fighters. They were funneled into Syria via Turkey. So, October of 2014, we had Turkey's parliament passing a resolution to allow the Turkish military to enter the sovereign territory of Iraq and Syria under the pretext of battling Western-backed Islamic State militants. We also had that resolution allowing for foreign troops to use Turkish territory for the same purpose, suggesting that the Incirlik air base would be used by the U.S. for airstrikes against Syria. And, of course, that's what's happened with this recent agreement. Only recently it was reported by the Turkish media that a formal agreement was reached between the United States and Turkey for the use of Incirlik against ISIS. So the vote on that resolution, what I'm talking about in the past, was passed 298 in favor, 98 opposed in the Turkish parliament. So despite the claims that the vote was centered around defeating ISIS on its borders, we had Turkish Prime Minister Recep Erdogan really inadvertently admitting that the real target of NATO would be the Syrian government. We go to BBC. Let me quote BBC here. It says, speaking in Parliament earlier on Wednesday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan urged the West to find a long-term solution to the crises in Syria and Iraq, pointing out that dropping tons of bombs on IS militants would only provide a temporary respite. While he said an effective struggle against Islamic State would be a priority for Turkey, the immediate removal of the administration in Damascus would also continue to be its priority. Erdogan also called for a buffer zone on the Turkey-Syria border, which would be enforced by a no-fly zone to ensure security. So, of course, we know that a buffer zone has been part of the NATO agenda against Syria since the beginning of the crisis in the country, and it was. You have to remember that it was under the guise of a humanitarian corridor or buffer zone in Libya that NATO bombing actually took place, which led to the destruction of the Libyan government and the murder of Gaddafi and the expansion of chaos and anarchy and genocide across the entire North African country. So the Brookings Institution, we have to mention Brookings in their memo assessing options for regime change written in 2012. Let me quote Brookings. An alternative is for diplomatic efforts to focus first on how to end the violence and how to gain humanitarian access, as is being done under Annan's leadership. This may lead to the creation of safe havens and humanitarian corridors, which would have to be backed by limited military power. This would, of course, fall short of U.S. goals for Syria and could preserve Assad in power. From that starting point, however, it is possible that a broad coalition with the appropriate international mandate could add further coercive action to its efforts. In other words, safe zones, buffer zones, etc. Let's move on where it talks about the multi-front war. Same document. Quote, in addition, Israel's intelligence services have a strong knowledge of Syria as well as its assets within the Syrian government that could be used to subvert the regime's power base and press for Assad's removal. Israel could posture forces on or near the Golan Heights and in so doing might divert regime forces from suppressing the opposition. This posture may conjure up fears in the Assad regime of a multi-front war, particularly if Turkey is willing to do the same on its border and if the Syrian opposition is being fed a steady diet of arms and training. Such a mobilization could perhaps persuade Syria's military leadership to oust Assad in order to preserve itself. Advocates argue this additional pressure could tip the balance against Assad inside Syria if other forces were aligned properly. So again, end quote, Turkey has been whining and bitching for some time about an influx of Syrian refugees as a result of the humanitarian crisis, but it's a humanitarian crisis that that Turkey created by funneling these death squad fighters into Syria. Now, the most recent influx of refugees, or one of the more relatively recent influx of refugees, came from the city of Kobani, or Ain al-Arab, where ISIS fighters were herded by American airstrikes for the purposes of reinforcing fighters already battling Kurdish and Syrian forces there. So we had other influxes of refugees coming from other borderline towns that have been facing heavy fighting there. So Tony Carlucci has an article, Turkey Preparing for Syria Occupation, where he says, quote, of course, with the U.S. airstrikes carving out a vacuum soon to be filled with extremists uncontested by the Syrian Arab army, forced to back off in fear of provoking further Western aggression, the situation will undoubtedly deteriorate. Just as Turkey staged false flag operations along its border last year in attempts to trigger a war with Syria directly, and by supporting terrorists resulting in a predictable humanitarian catastrophe now spilling over into Turkey's territory, The vacuum of the U.S. is intentionally creating is meant to be filled with terrorist mercenaries and NATO forces to protect them as the front is inched ever closer to Damascus in the form of a buffer zone." End quote. So, I mean, clearly we have the Turkish agenda here is not focused on combating ISIS. If it was, the Turks would have long ago sealed their own borders with Syria and ceased to train ISIS and facilitate ISIS going into Turkish territory. Turkey's not requesting assistance for spillover violence or cross-border attacks. It's requesting a military invasion using a problem that it helped create as the pretext and justification. So they don't want a buffer zone to end terrorism within their own country. They need to seal the borders with Syria. That's what they really need. So this is, before we go on to talk about this recent ISIL-free zone, in other words, a buffer zone, let me give some solutions here, since we're all about solutions. We want to throw these out for the Turks. The first thing you need to do is to seal the borders with Syria. Seal them, cut them off. Nobody goes in or out without proper documentation and vetting. Cease the funding, the training, and facilitation of terrorists that are operating inside your borders. Alongside this, we need a massive sting operation that nets and eliminates these organizations. Not the fake sting operation that we've seen from Erdogan, but we want a real one. We also would just suggest to the Turkish people and other well-meaning members of the Turkish government to back away from Erdogan, back away from his idiotic policies and his equally idiotic Islamic government. Turkey, you're going to have to put aside political Islam. You should not be interested in political Islam. That is theocracy. It's a joke. It's a return to the pre-civilization. Forget it. March toward a secular government. And also, you're going to have to start pursuing some type of reasonable and fair policy toward the Kurds in the southeastern parts of the country. So, unfortunately, I don't think that Turkey's showing any signals that they're going to move toward those solutions, but we've got to throw them out there just so they will be out in the universe floating around, so maybe somebody can grasp onto them at some point. Now, let's talk about the ISIL-free zone. We've got about 10 minutes here, so I've got to cover this as quickly as possible. Now, the NATO Article 4 meeting that we've just been talking about concluded with virtually no big decisions. The meeting concluded with everyone in NATO saying that we stand in solidarity with Turkey, but no NATO decision was made beyond the statement of solidarity. There was a decision made, though, and it wasn't made at the NATO meeting. It was made bilaterally a few days before the Article 4 meeting between Turkey and the United States. And this is, you almost wonder whether or not this Article 4 meeting was a bait and switch to get people to watch it and ignore the bilateral meeting. This agreement between the U.S. and Turkey effectively creates a buffer zone that's going to span the Turkish border, span from the Turkish borderline into Syria. It's going to go from Azaz in the west to Jarablus in the east in Syria, and as far south as Al-Bab. The width of the zone is going to be about 68 miles. It's going to extend around 40 miles deep into Syria. That's going to be right on the doorstep of Aleppo. Now, the zone is going to be much smaller than the zone that Turkey and the United States have been calling for over the last few years. It's not even going to stretch the length of the Turkey-Syria border, but it is a start for a greater buffer zone. I mean, now we have a buffer zone in existence. The U.S. and Turkey are attempting to obfuscate the fact that their new agreement is the creation of a no-fly zone because they've renamed it an ISIL-free zone. And this is the same tactic that they used when the term no-fly zone and buffer zone began to draw too much ire from observers about a year ago. Then they changed the term to safe zone. And now the NATO powers are playing semantics yet again and deeming the area an ISIL-free zone It sounds like a brand of Diet Coke or something. Some type of product placement, product branding. Semantics, unfortunately, have served NATO and the United States well over the years. After all, we had a simple name change of a terrorist organization that was made by the Anglo-American powers that was somehow magically able to create moderate rebels out of the death squad terrorists. It was somehow able to produce moderate rebels as well as the most frightening terrorist organization the world has ever seen out of the same group of terrorists, simply because of a name change. Isn't that amazing? Now, the description of the ISIL free zone is that it's going to be a distinguished area in which the Turkish and U.S. military will engage in aggressive operations against ISIS. It's said that this is according to the NATO powers. It said this area is going to function as a place where civilians displaced by the Syrian crisis may run to for safe haven, and where moderate rebel forces can maintain a higher presence free from the battles with ISIS. This Washington Post says, quote, once the area is cleared, the plan is to give control to as yet unidentified moderate Syrian rebel groups. The United States and Turkey have differing interpretations as to which groups can be defined as moderate. Yeah, well, not really. The reality of this is that the ISIL free zone is going to be nothing more than a forward operating base, which is launching terrorists deeper into Syria. There's been no mention of the question of what would happen if the Syrian Air Force began bombing ISIS positions within the ISIL free zone. Would NATO interfere? Would NATO shoot the Syrian planes down? What if the Syrian Air Force began attacking the non-existent moderate rebels in the zone? Would NATO shoot the planes down then? That's if the answer to that is yes, then it's a buffer zone. Then it's a no-fly zone. Now, we've got to look at the justifications about the ISIL free zone. First, the idea that there's even any such thing as a moderate rebel force operating inside Syria has been debunked time and time and time again. There were no moderate forces in Syria at all, and this alleged opposition was nothing more than jihadists and terrorists. This is something that we've been through. Now, there is the second myth that there's a war on ISIS being conducted by the U.S. coalition and Turkey to begin with. For two countries opposed to ISIS, you could easily be convinced of the opposite after you examine the facts on the ground. Turkey's long acted as a funnel and a conduit for ISIS crossing into Syria, and the U.S. can be credited with the creation of ISIS to begin with. The aid provided to so-called moderate rebels, the U.S. and Turkey have armed ISIS directly and funded them, provided them with the necessary logistics and intelligence to conduct successful attacks in Iraq and Syria. Now, you remember U.S. airstrikes allegedly against ISIS in Iraq and Syria have likewise been questionable at best. The U.S. airstrikes have largely targeted Syrian infrastructure, civilian areas, Syrian food storage facilities. American airstrikes have been notorious for dropping supplies to ISIS and firing on the Iraqi military. There was instances where the U.S. had targeted ISIS, but it was largely an effort of death squad herding, border shaping, or protecting Western oil fields. Remember, like in Erbil. So that's what we've got going on there. We've just got a couple minutes left. I want to make this extremely important point about what the buffer zone itself is. If you look at the map, and we're going to talk about the Kurdish question later, if you look at the map of where this ISIL free zone is supposed to be, you'll see in the northwest of Syria, there's a small portion along the Syria-Turkey border that's been completely controlled by the Kurds. If you'll look at the far end of the Turkey-Syria border, you'll see from that eastern tip of the Syrian border all the way to, well, I guess we could actually say northwest Syria, there is a large area where the Kurds have control. The only area that the Kurds do not have control is an area that spans in the east from Jarablus to an area that is in the west around the place called Dabik. Right, so virtually the same dimensions of the ISIL free zone. Now, essentially what's happened is that the Kurds, in the areas where they've taken over, have cut ISIL supply lines. They've cut those supply lines, and the only areas where ISIL is able to get its supplies through is this small area in the middle, where it's like a bottleneck of terrorists and terrorist supplies coming through the Turkey-Syria border. If the Kurds, and there's lots of evidence to show that the Kurds were about to mount an attack there, it was coming very soon. If the Kurds had taken over this small area that continues to remain open, then ISIL supply lines would have been cut entirely from Syria. The only other way to get ISIL supplies and ISIL fighters into Syria would have been to go all the way around to around the world, essentially, because you're going to have to deal with Iran too. So the ISIL supply lines were cut. If you look on the map, and it's in my article, the article entitled "Turkey's War on the Kurds, ISIS Air Force Flies Again." Please go look at that. The map's toward the bottom, and you'll see what this is. The ISIL free zone is nothing more than the protection of the last open supply lines for ISIS. They are protecting ISIS supply lines through U.S. and NATO bombing and Turkish bombing. They're keeping those supply lines open. That's what the whole idea behind this is. We're going to talk about this more in the coming weeks, but first I want to run, because it runs about 30 minutes, I want to run my interview with Afraa from Syria to get a real Syrian perspective on the issue. Ladies and gentlemen, keep coming back. Truth on the Tracks every Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Let's get this interview rolling. Okay, so I'm back here again with my friend Afraa from Syria, and we're going to discuss some of the new developments that have been taking place. We've had the recent bombing of Syria by Turkey, the creation of a buffer zone or a no-fly zone, which they are calling an ISIL-free zone. So we're going to get into a little bit of that tonight and talk about it. Afraa, what have you experienced in terms of the bombing? I know you're not in the area where the bombing is taking place, but what is your opinion on Turkey's recent bombing of Syria and bombing the Kurds?
Hello. Yeah, recently the events here about Turkey, the first was Turkey is bombing the so-called ISIS, and this is irony because we know the role of Turkey, the important role of Turkey in supporting those mercenaries from all over the world to cross its border into Syria. And we know also about the camps inside Turkey to train those foreign fighters and then send them to Syria. So when Turkey is pretending that this country is fighting against the so-called ISIS, this is illusion. And the other pretext that they are bombing Kurds inside Syria, and they claimed that without violation Syria. And this is an important point. When you bomb inside another country, even if you didn't violate the airspace, but without any permission of this country, that is violation of the sovereignty of this country. So the close goal is to bomb some sites of Kurds. This is maybe true because we know that Erdogan has his enemy inside another party, which is included Kurds inside it, and also Armenian, like the Federation of Socialist Youth. And he started to arrest some of these protesters inside Turkey under the name that they are belonging to mercenaries or to radical Islamists. And they are only some young men, and those belong to party which is opponent of Erdogan party, the Justice and Development Party. So maybe America wants to let those to destroy each other, mutual destruction between the Kurds and Erdogan. this is not that problem for USA. But the real goal I see here is Syria. It is about USA is being invasion Syria. And I have read some documents about this. And I see this is the real aim. The document is recently written by Brookings Institute in Washington. And the plan is to let the allies of USA to be more involved inside Syria. And as you mentioned, Brandon, to create the buffer zone, and they name it, or they call it, the safe zone or the free zone, free of what they call them ISIS, and I call them foreign fighters. They train those fighters and send them to Syria. They said to topple the leader here, our government, and also they said those fighters will fight the so-called ISIS, while the only one is fighting ISIS inside Syria is Syrian Arab Army. Anyone have not noticed the moderate rebel in the ground? I don't think so. So those fighters join the so-called ISIS, and I see this is the real aim, to create this buffer zone, this safe zone. They call it free from ISIS, but full of their proxies here. Maybe the proxies is the foreign fighters. You will see them in the south of Syria, next to Jordan and Israel, and also in the north of Syria with Kurdish, maybe. Kurds want to create their own entity, and also Erdogan is fighting them for this. Erdogan don't want them to create their own entity, their own state inside Turkey also, as he knew and he knows what they want to do inside Syria, partition of Syria. So the whole aim is deconstructing Syria towards regionalized strategy for a federal country. That is what is really going on here after all this conflict.
Yeah, and you mentioned.
What is your opinion on it?
I think you're right. If you mentioned the Brookings Institution documents, there was a document that was called "Assessing Options for Regime Change" that was written in 2012 by Brookings. And in that document, they talked about the creation of what they called a safe zone or a humanitarian zone, which is essentially a buffer zone or a no-fly zone. And from that zone, they can use the terrorists and push them further into Syria and use NATO and U.S. and Turkish air forces as an air force for Al-Qaeda, essentially. They also talked about creating a multi-front war, and that's how they labeled it, which means constantly having Assad having to respond to ISIS coming over the borders of Turkey, and when he responds to that, then all of a sudden the Israelis bomb on the southern or southwestern portion, and when he responds to that, ISIL forces come back across the Turkish border. So it always has him going from north to south to north to south, and it's a constant state of confusion and realignment. So that was written about in 2012 by Brookings, and so you're right to point that out. It's a very important document that people can find online just by going to Google and typing that in.
Exactly, and also our border in the east in Iraq, it is at once this buffer zone or this safe zone created easy for the troops of America to cross it, to control it. So our trouble, our problem is our border. All the time I mention it, we have surrounded by a really hard border, really hard neighborhood from the geopolitics side.
Yeah, and also if people will look on the map, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but on the northwest part of Syria, the Kurds have seized border crossings, and in the northeastern part they've seized border crossings, and there's one small area that ISIL is coming through, and that is where the Turks and the United States have created this buffer zone, because if that area gets taken over by the Kurds or by the Syrian army, then ISIS is cut off from its supply routes, and they don't want that.
They don't want that at all, exactly. Yeah, they need this ISIS for the war on Syria, for the pretext for them to train more foreign fighters and to send them to Syria under the pretext those moderate rebels, they are fighting ISIS. And the moderate rebel is illusion. They are the same fighter, they send them to Syria and they spend a horrible budget on them. Yes, this is illusion, and they don't want to get rid of ISIS because they created this to be their wrong pretext to come to invade Syria. This is very true. And lately, Brandon, not only Turkey is trying to be ready here in Syria, also Israel lately bombed or targeted a car of nation defense forces in Al-Qunaitra in Syria. Also, Jordan with Turkey have mutual military rooms for operation for sending more fighters to the south of Syria and supply them by more tanks and vehicles equipped with a machine gun, with snipers. They want to cross Suwaida to encircle Damascus. So the war is escalated by those from every side of Syria. So it is not only about Turkey. I see that USA wants to escalate the war from every side of Syria, and I see that before December, before the deal of Iran be more effective and Iran can get its frozen money, and for sure Iran will help Syria. And I see USA doesn't want this. USA wants this catastrophic conflict to be more in Syria, and to create a buffer zone to control the situation in Syria more. And in that way, our army will be hard for us to provocate these troops of USA in that buffer zone. God forbid. I hope that will not succeed.
Yeah, and thankfully the buffer zone right now is very small. It's just around that northern border area, but we saw this in Libya where they created a buffer zone that involved the U.S. military bombing Libyan air forces and anti-air defense missiles, and it turned into essentially a full-scale war. And it's a very dangerous situation. But Assad has had a few victories on the ground recently, right? The Syrian military has done pretty well in sort of the central areas of Syria that were taken over, like Idlib. There's been some successes around Idlib, right?
Idlib, and also the Badani in Damascus, also in Kalamun, and also towards Palmyra. And we didn't hear about this in the mainstream media, while when Palmyra was under the control of the so-called ISIS, all the media was talking about the collapsing of Syrian Arab Army, and that was not true, because we have an important front to stay on it. We have only our army, while those mercenaries come from all over the world. So we should control some front. It is so important to protect all Syria. So if we left, for example, Kalamun or Zabadani to Palmyra, we will lose pause. But when you control Kalamun and you clean it from the terrorists, and you cut the supply from the terrorists across Lebanon to Syria, so later it will be easy to go to Palmyra and to liberate it.
The strategy with the Syrian military is to stop the flow of terrorists coming in first, because if you fight them on the battlefield and you win a number of battles and they're still coming in, it's a losing battle. But if you can stop them at the borders, then you're able to really eventually surround them and starve them out, which is why they impose the buffer zone now.
Yes, exactly. The important to cut the supply line via many fronts like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Also Israel. We shouldn't forget Israel. And by the way, USA will never give Israel up, and also Saudi Arabia, for sure. So everything is going on here for the advantage of Israel.
Yeah, that's a very unfortunate thing that we have to deal with here in the U.S. is the constant support of Israel, regardless of what they do. I always say that Israel is ready to fight to the last American, meaning that they can pick a fight and they know that the United States will always come in and back them up, protect them.
Exactly. And I want to ask you something, because when I all the time say about the so-called ISIS, and I say that ISIS is not the real threat for Syria, the policy of US and US and Turkey and the Arab Gulf and those mercenaries, so the war will be end easily. So the real core here, the real reason about all this is those sponsors of the so-called ISIS. But another people say, no, ISIS is the real threat. So I ask here, why before the so-called Arab Spring there was no ISIS in Syria?
Yeah, the ISIS is entirely created by the United States. There never would have been an issue with them to begin with had it not been for NATO and the West. More documents that you may be aware of were released by the Defense Intelligence Agency. These were written also in 2012, and they said in these documents that they knew there was the creation of a fundamentalist jihadist network going across from, they call it a jihadist principality, a Salafist principality going from eastern Syria to western Iraq, and that the United States and NATO were supporting this. And of course that's ISIS. That's what ISIS is. And they even made it clear that they knew from the very beginning that the so-called revolution was made up of terrorists and jihadists, and that they were actually funding them and supporting them. So it's not a question. The so-called rebels are nothing but terrorists, and they're jihadists, and they're supported by the West. They always were. The Arab Spring itself was created by the West.
Exactly, it is the constructive chaos, and the situation now is a whole mess. This fighting, Turkey is fighting, Kurds was being supported by USA, and now USA is giving the green card to Turkey to destroy them, and you don't know who support who and who fight who. This is what they want. They want a catastrophic conflict in the region to be lately to be more allowed to the troops of such NATO or such UNIFIL to be here. So that's what they want in this country. They want to make it exactly as Kosovo. Also, Kurdish want to have their own state. That remember us of what happened in Kosovo. I see the same situation.
Yeah, another person named Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the former national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, and he helped create Al-Qaeda back in the 1970s, and they called them the Mujahideen. He wrote that he wanted to see the creation of micro-states and mini-states, to find governments like Syria and in Europe, where you mentioned Kosovo, to break them up into small, tiny states that couldn't resist the will of NATO or the United States or even big banks and corporations. So it's a documented plan that Brzezinski wrote about. It's definitely a strategy.
Exactly, and also the documents on the Brookings, the title was, after this buffer zone is created, they will turn it into autonomous regions. So as you said, small states with autonomous regions, partition of Syria.
Yeah, they want part of it to be Kurdish, part of it to be Sunni, but really not even Sunni, more jihadist, and then the western part to be maybe concede that to Assad or a transition of power. But most certainly a weak state that's much weaker than anything Syria has seen in decades.
Yeah, exactly. To weaken Syria, divide Syria, and destroy Syria as they did in Libya.
So what is the situation like for you? Go ahead.
I just want to remember something from the first beginning of this so-called revolution here. The protesters was asking our government to allow, here in Syria, it was banned to have the full hijab. The full veil was banned. You can't put the normal one. But, they asked to allow to our country to make it allowed here in Syria. The full...
the veil.
Exactly. So you can see, or you can link now the same look at those so-called ISIS and the women there. You'll see what the first revolutionaries, as they call them, ask for. You will see the same. It depends also on the herd theory. You will see those so-called ISIS and Toyota groups, and they wear same clothes as they have manufactory somewhere, and their flag, everything is organized. So there is some theory behind them, like in movie, and they want to affect your eye, your ear, everywhere. So the music, when they put on their YouTube, when they committed some crime, like beheaded some foreign journalists, also as a pretext for invasion, also the country. You see, after they claimed that they beheaded some journalists, it was this coalition which they call it anti-ISIS. But in the movie, you see the music, the song, the way they wear, also the arrange for the victims, their victims. So you will see something like movie, like herd theory. Everything was planned. It is not ISIS coming from another planet or so. No, they make it.
Yeah, absolutely. And most of those videos were made with pretty good studio technology that ISIS, some guys in the desert would not have had, particularly if they're fighting a war. It's because it was created with the help of Western intelligence. But it's good that you point that out, because while the protesters and the early rebels were calling for the veil for women, our media was telling us that they wanted freedom, and they wanted freedom of speech, and they wanted women's rights, and that type of thing. It's total opposite of what they wanted.
Lately, when they started to bomb in Syria and to make suicide bombers, so when the women on this veil, so when there is a checkpoint for police, you cannot touch her or check her also. But our police is so clever, so they put women to check the woman. So this is okay, not men. So it was under the veil. It was men with veils of bombs. So everything was planned. This is never revolution for.
Yeah, I've actually seen some pictures of terrorists in the full veil trying to get into government-held territory and that sort of thing. It's an embarrassing way to go out, but it fits them.
Yeah, and also, Brandon, when you see them on YouTube, you will see how they are organized, the way they wear, and how they look strong. And oh my God, no one can defeat ISIS. They are horrible. But lately, our soldiers in blessed month of Ramadan captured one of those ISIS, and we watched the interview with him on TV. He said, "I am Iraqi one," and you see how he was trembling and how he is idiot one, and he has no education at all. He said, "I don't read." They asked him, "Are you Muslim? Is that in Quran to beheaded everyone?" He said, "I don't know about Quran because I don't know how to read. I never been to school. So why you are in this ISIS?" He said, "I don't know. They asked us in Iraq, some Chechen one, to join them, and they paid for us by dollar. So we joined them. We got money, and they said there in Syria they are kafir. So we joined them." He was trembling and said, "I didn't kill anyone." How they captured him? He was away of the group of him to drink some water. He wasn't fasting, so our army shot him on his leg and captured him to ask him some details. And he didn't know exactly the higher boss of him. He is in touch with some. They have leaders, foreign leaders, and some Arabic one. So ISIS is really fiction, not true. I mean, the threat of ISIS is not true. The threat is behind those who sponsored ISIS.
Yeah, even early on, many of the fighters couldn't read. They didn't know who was in charge. They didn't know where the money was coming from. They didn't know anything. And a lot of them are actually either they're mercenaries, they're paid, or they're mentally ill. They're insane. So they have a lot of mental patients who are making up the ranks of this as well. So, of course, they come from all over the world. They come from Saudi Arabia and Libya as well. In our media, they tell us that this is a civil war, but it can't be a civil war if most of the participants are from a foreign country.
Exactly. Even when they was calling themselves Free Syrian Army, most of them were from Libya and Tunisia. And also when someone from Tunisia went back to his country, also they interviewed him in Tunisian TV, covered all his eyes to protect him. He said also he joined this war to get money, and they think those people in Syria are kafir. And he regrets that because it was horrible what they did to be people here. So it is the same, those who joined the Free Syrian Army, same those who joined the ISIS. And he said that they paid them, they paid to banks in Turkey. They have lists by the names of those fighters, and they sent them money to the bank. The central bank for them is in Turkey. Turkey is totally involved in this war. And Erdogan, after an official figure in the Congress accused him of, and he was right to accuse him of supporting ISIS, Erdogan won this play to say, look, I am fighting terrorists, I don't support them. And also after he lost the election, he got less voices. For the another stage of election, he wants to look like he is fighting terrorists. And I suspect that the bombing in the city of Turkey, in the border, which called Soros, was done by ISIS. ISIS didn't do anything without permission of their masters. And as well as this city full of Kurds, or full of some young people, as I said, they belong to the opponent party of socialist party. They are the enemy of Erdogan, so it was easy to bomb them. And when they make the demonstration to arrest them under the pretext that Erdogan is arrest those who are against, who belong to radical Islamists. So it is play to see that Erdogan is good and he's fighting ISIS and his party for his reputation.
Yeah, it's theater, and he's been supporting them from day one, and some of us could see early on that this was going to lead to some type of military confrontation with the Kurds, and it's unfortunate that the Kurdish people will have to deal with this, and the Turkish people and the Syrian people will have to deal with this. But I think Erdogan is insane. Erdogan seems to believe that he's going to be able to rule the Middle East, and it's not going to happen. He's a clown, and this is what happens. So yeah, I agree with you that this is just theater. It's that ISIS would not have committed this bombing necessarily if it had not been told to do so by some intelligence agency.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we're coming up on the end of time here, the end of our time. Is there anything else you would like to say to people listening or watching?
I just want to say that our Syrian Arab Army now is achieving great victory in many sides of Syria, and this is great news. And we trust in our Syrian Arab Army, and I hope this evil plan of the West about invasion Syria will not success. Thank you, Brandon.
So do I. Thank you for the interview. Best of luck.
Thank you. Good luck for you too.
This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
The president is about to take the country deeper into Syria's civil war. Turkey and the U.S. have agreed to use air power to set up a safe zone inside Syria for rebel groups who are willing to battle ISIS. Holly Williams is in Turkey following this story for us tonight.
Turkish officials refuse to give exact boundaries, but say the safe zone will be north of the Syrian city of Aleppo, and told us airstrikes will clear ISIS militants from this 60-mile section of the border. The increased number of airstrikes will give cover to so-called moderate rebels as they fight ISIS. But it's not clear which or how many rebels will be protected, some of whom are linked to Al-Qaeda. America's $500 million plan to train and equip moderate Syrian rebels has so far only yielded around 60 fighters. Turkey hopes the safe zone will eventually encourage some Syrian refugees to return home. Nearly 2 million Syrians have fled to Turkey since the country's civil war began over 4 years ago. But airstrikes near Aleppo would bring US operations closer than ever to the Syrian regime's air defenses.